Okay, in this video, I want to talk about a story of how I got into folk music. Folk music is the genre that I live in, or at least that I'd say that I live in. But me being me, I have to overthink it and overcomplicate it. I started taking the idea of being a musician seriously in my late 20s, when I knew I was too old to be like a pop star. I was like, okay, I'll be an old musician. I'm good with that. And I did think, all right, well, I've jumped around into all these different genres. I mean, in my early 20s, I was really interested in what is now EDM, Daft Punk, Aphex Twin, Warp Records, this whole thing, playing with samplers. And by my late 20s, I realized that, one of the main reasons why I was playing around with samplers is just that there wasn't the consumer technology to really be able to record the kind of stuff that I was more generally listening to, which was singer-songwriters, really. I mean, my big hero is Tom Waits, but also singer-songwriters like, and sometimes singer-songwriters who work within bands, so like Suzanne Vega or Neil Finn from Crowded House, or Elliott Smith, or Nick Drake, or Dar Williams, or there's kind of a bunch of them. And that all seemed to be more in the kind of folk sphere, Leonard Cohen as well. And so I thought, I guess it's kind of folk music. But I did think it's probably like what I guess you would... Because I think like a lot of musicians do fret over this. What is the genre? Nothing, no box feels that comfortable. And so I thought, I guess it's contemporary folk. I'm not really interested in the twiddly-twiddly-dee traditional folk stuff. Or so I thought. Well, how did it start? Maybe it was just being interested in, well, I wonder what traditional folk music is like. And there was a band that I saw on TV that I learned was local, was from Oxford, a band called Bellowhead. And then I found there was a folk festival, a local Oxford folk festival, and I went to see Bellowhead play at the Oxford Folk Festival, and that was a bit of a life-changing moment, I suppose. I'll tell the story of that another time. That started to get me interested in traditional music. What Bellowhead and particularly Spiers and Boden did was music from this area, a lot of it influenced by the folk dancing known as Morris dancing, and again, more of that in a bit. And it was really upbeat and it was really joyful. And I hadn't heard really any sort of older music from the culture that I come from England, that was sort of upbeat and almost sort of carnival-like. It was sort of celebratory. And yeah, I as is becoming a pattern in these videos, I went down the rabbit hole deep and got really fascinated and sort of obsessed by it. And then, as is also kind of part of my brand, I started to have problems with it. It did feel very cliquey and very sort of elitist, but to a certain extent. I was coming to it late. I was coming to it aged about 30, and a lot of the people who were on the local folk scene had got folky parents and had been playing since they were born. So I felt very intimidated by that. And looking back, I do feel like it's hard to set up these community environments. Most folk music, like where folk music lives, certainly in this country, is in folk music sessions. It's sort of generally in pubs, people just turn up and play. It's essentially like a jam session. And it's hard to get those right in a way that's inclusive. And I really didn't feel like, I sort of really didn't feel welcome. I didn't know the kind of, I guess, the etiquette. There's always etiquette to these kind of places. Also, like, I didn't know enough about the folk music. So I kind of felt awkward. But I think, yeah, everyone who wasn't brought up in it goes through that. But as I really started to sort of get the hang of it, I started to be more uncomfortable about another aspect of it, which is that it seemed to be music rooted in history, but a parallel history. Not the history because by the time I was like 30 and getting into this, I don't really was interested in history and had a good sense of it. And I thought so much of folk music is based on stuff that just doesn't add up for me. And I'll probably talk a lot more about this in the future, but I heard people talking about English traditional music, English folk song specifically, as being part of an oral tradition. And that kind of seemed weird. And I now do not believe that to be the case. And this is perhaps a contentious point. But England had a culture of commercial popular music from the 1500s onwards. It was a country that had relatively high literacy for religious reasons, and when the printing press came along, people used to sell broadsides, sheets of with song lyrics on them. And it was I think it was kind of the equivalent of selling CDs out the back of your car. And that went from mid 1500s in this country right up to sort of late 1800s. And so, it was a commercial popular music business. Now, there are examples of English folk songs that have been collected, particularly by families. But you generally don't have to dig too far back to find out. Yeah, it was, the song which was collected from a family was you can think of it as like a pop hit, sort of 20, 30 years before. Shall I do this? I know this video is going to get really long, but I will give one specific example. Oh God, shall I get the book? I'll get the book. Through the miracle of editing. Right, there's a famous moment in English folk music history where folk collector Cecil Sharp heard his gardener singing a song called The Seeds of Love, which is great alliteration. Singing The Seeds of Love. And he was like, oh, this is clearly part of an English folk tradition, and he collected the song. What I have here is a book called Popular Music of the Olden Times, written by a chap called W. Chappell of Chappell Publishing, and he wrote 2 volumes on English popular music. And Seeds of Love is in this, and this particular book was published in, is this the one with the inscription? Yeah, in 1869. And Cecil Sharp collected that folk song in 1899, so pretty much exactly 30 years beforehand. Seeds of Love is in this book. It was a pop hit. If you're collecting it and saying it's a folk tradition thing, it does suggest it's an oral tradition, a song that just arose in the fields. But this song probably was written by a commercial songwriter who... And then it was probably performed in music halls, and then eventually, this gardener's parents probably would sing it around the house, and then he grew up singing it. So it's kind of misleading to suggest that it's this oral tradition, rural subculture. I feel like England has wanted to create the idea that there is this sort of innocent rural underclass or kind of working class that was in no way involved with the shenanigans of the British Empire. I just don't think that stacks up. Anyway, I have so many rabbit holes I can go down here. I'll try and wind this back and actually be a bit more specific. So, I felt like there was this parallel history in folk music. The way that I would describe it is I felt like I was a historian going to academic conferences on the influence of King Arthur and finding that everyone else at the conference believed King Arthur was a real guy and there really was a lady in the lake and all the magical stuff was true. And I feel like I'm the only one who's going, it's myth, right? We all know it's myth. And everyone else is saying, you, sir, are not fit to sit at the table of Camelot. And I think probably quite a lot of people, actually, who are interested in English folk music have the same slight discomfort that I do about that it is this sort of parallel history. But after a while, I just felt like I was interested in having a career as a folk musician. And first of all, I concluded there wasn't any money in it. I wouldn't be able to pay the bills. It's the kind of brutal truth of it. I might have been able to kind of put up with that, even though it's a very kind of selfish thought. But fundamentally, I felt like this is just going to drive me nuts. What interests me about this music is the actual sort of... is uncovering history as accurately as we can. We can't do it 100% accurately, but we can do our best. And there just doesn't seem to be a priority with the folk music business. I'm not a fan of the music business. I'm much more of a fan of the folk music industry than I am of the music industry. But still, like I feel like it basically serves, middle-aged people sort of from my age and background, in a kind of soothing, don't worry, here's a kind of rural idyll, you don't need to worry about anything. It's kind of vibe. And that's not what interests me. I'm much more interested in the commercial popular music side of this whole thing. I think it's sort of an untapped source of really interesting stuff. And a lot of it is really bad, and I'll talk about that more in other videos. And a lot of it is very difficult to kind of, there's a lot of context we just don't have. But I find it fascinating. And that was the thing I really wanted to get my teeth stuck into. But I came to the conclusion I can't really operate as a musician in the folk world, nationally, internationally, whatever, and be interested in this stuff. It's a different thing. So I started fretting about, maybe I'm not folk after all. Maybe I should describe myself more as traditional, with the idea being that when a work is out of copyright, it's described as traditional. And I was like, okay, that's really what I'm into. I'm interested in stuff that's English and that's not in copyright because it's old. And I sort of fretted about, but then maybe that's not it, because, all kinds of levels of overthinking. At one point I was like, it's historical popular music. Can I just call it historical pop? And after a while, at the end of all that, I was just like, you know what? It's folk music. It's fine. It's just folk music. If you're watching this being like, wow, God, this is going on a bit. This is sort of the response I get when people would ask me, so, you do folk music? And I'd be like, well, it's kind of folk music. But if you, and then 20 minutes into it, I just see the glazed eyes and I'd be like, it's folk music. It's fine. It's folk music. Mumford & Sons? Yeah, fine. It's kind of like that. And so that's kind of where I've ended up. But it's really I think I've always been a pop fan more than anything else, and it's really just tracing popular music back. Actually, I feel like the real kind of ancestors of pop music, which kind of kicked off in the, I guess you could say, 30s, 40s, 50s, whatever. The real ancestors were poets, and I'll say why I think that in some other video as well. But the other thing I was going to say is that I will be talking in the process videos about music history in a slightly different way. I think it's generally understood in terms of movements, like you could say, for example, like hip hop or techno or punk or rock and roll or whatever, or romantic music, classical music, Baroque music, and it's generally seen as there are kind of these various leading figures, and that is useful. But for me, when you really kind of get into it, it's not as useful as looking at music in terms of what was the technology available and how did musicians pay the bills? Because that, I think, really defines how the history of music developed. The example I think of is Beethoven. Beethoven was one of the first musicians who was able to actually make money commercially. I should have looked this up before talking about this. I did look up some stuff, but actually, now that I'm in front of the camera, I'm like, I don't know enough about this. But as far as I recall, he was one of the first musicians who wasn't dependent on wealthy patrons, but could actually make money from sort of concerts for the public. I think maybe one of the differences with Beethoven is that, unlike so many of the other musicians, he was born dirt poor, so damn right he found out how to monetize it. But I feel like you can talk about him being part of the Romantic movement and a reaction against the Enlightenment and these various things, concentrating more on feeling than on intellect. And that's why he had this very sort of emotional sound. But I think one of the most significant things about Beethoven's sound is that he was one of the first musicians to have a piano that was good, that was modern, that really kind of worked. And when you understand how a piano is different from its predecessors, the harpsichord and the like, you can start to see that someone was going to do music like Beethoven at some point. The full name of the piano actually is in Italian, and I don't know all of it, but like it was known as the pianoforte, which is Italian for quiet loud. And the thing about the piano was that, unlike the harpsichord, where you can whack it pretty hard and it's pretty much the same volume, you can play really quiet on a piano and you can play really loud. And Beethoven was one of the first people to really play with this, I think, in classical music. He just really turned the dial up. The quiet bits are really quiet and the loud bits are really sort of over the top, almost to the point of parody. In fact, Beethoven's often parodying himself with it. So that's the kind of stuff I want to talk about. I want to talk about music history and kind of dive into that. And I come at it from an English perspective, really, because that's the culture that I know. And I feel like I want to specialize in that. And if I want to kind of step outside that culture, I will talk to people who know that culture better than I do. That's kind of where I'm coming from, I guess. Shit. Are we still on? I've just noticed the battery's running out, so I'm going to wind up now.